Baldoni as her love interest. He is also the director of the film.
Kind of.
In name, in title.
In name.
When you see the movie, the title says he is the director.
It's not the movie he thought he was directing.
No, and so there's been a lot of talk about why they are really not getting along. When they showed up at the premiere, he refused to take any photos, any group photos with Blake Lively. So there's beef here, but no one attached to the film will say specifically what.
Is Vanzan the boogeyman? That's what Blake Lively and her legal team are trying to claim. In a legal back and forth that happened recently, the judge pretty much shot down the motion to force Wayfair to provide more information. The reason? The court argued that Wayfair didn't follow proper legal procedures. They didn't go to court first, they didn't meet with the other side before filing, and they didn't handle things in the right way. This didn't stop them, though, from revealing some important details about the lawsuit, which is starting to show some cracks in Blake's defense. Even though Blake Lively and her team try to act like they are not behind the lawsuit, they are. They are using a different law firm, and they've made it clear that neither Blake nor her husband, Ryan Reynolds, will show up for the deposition that was supposed to happen on Monday. This deposition was meant to clear up what happened with Vanzan and the lawsuit. There were some legal points brought up by Kevin Fritz, Wayfair's lawyer, that I think are worth mentioning, even though the motion was already denied. Kevin Fritz and Wayfair were pushing for the judge to make Blake Lively testify and explain the full timeline of her relationship with Stephanie Jones, who is linked to Vanzan. Wayfair's argument was that there may have been some collusion between Vanzan and Stephanie Jones. They questioned why Stephanie would hand over important information to a shell company in New York without putting up a fight. They felt like this seemed suspicious and wanted to make sure they got the full picture of what happened. Here's some more context. Miss Abel, a party involved in the case, made a counterclaim against Stephanie Jones and said that just before she was about to leave Jones' works, Stephanie took her phone, accessed its contents, and downloaded information. Abel's counterclaim also said that Jones shared private text messages with Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and others, which were used to harm Abel. Abel also alleged that Lively and Jones conspired to steal Abel's communications under the guise of a legal process. On September 27, 2024, Blake Lively used her company, Vanzan, to file a lawsuit in the New York State Supreme Court against some unknown defendants. The complaint in this lawsuit claimed that the defendants breached unspecified obligations through unclear agreements. A few days later, Vanzan issued a subpoena to Stephanie Jones and her team, demanding documents related to a film called It Ends With Us and allegations of sexual harassment and retaliation during the film's production. However, none of these claims were mentioned in the Vanzan lawsuit itself. Jones then handed over Abel's communications to Vanzan, which seems to further complicate things. The Vanzan lawsuit was dropped in December 2024, but by then, some of Abel's stolen communications had already been included in the pleadings. There was a lot of fighting over what documents had to be disclosed and who would represent Vanzan at the deposition. The main issue was who from the company would show up as a corporate representative, and whether they could ask questions related to the lawsuit before September 27, 2024. What stood out to me was how the parties involved in this case, especially Vanzan, were acting like they were hiding behind a mask. They didn't want to admit that Vanzan was a shell company, and instead, they tried to make it seem like all the lawyers involved were separate from Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. It seemed like a lot of posturing and gaslighting, with Vanzan pretending that there were no real issues when, in fact, things were very complicated. Vanzan even responded to the claims, accusing the defendants of trying to use the court to advance an unfounded narrative and create media coverage. They claimed that they had already agreed to comply with the deposition, so the motion to compel should have been dismissed. The judge didn't dismiss it, but instead, he pointed out that Vanzan didn't follow proper legal procedures. They failed to meet and confer with the other party before filing, which was a key mistake. It seems like the case is still ongoing, with a lot of legal maneuvering and drama unfolding behind the scenes. The case was dismissed due to a technical issue, meaning if the arguments aren't resolved, Kevin can try again and file a new motion. The issue at hand involves Vanzan's objections about the time period of certain topics. The court claimed that Vanzan never had a proper discussion with the other party about these issues, and that they never refused to provide testimony on the topics in question. When the motion was filed, they asked the defendants to withdraw it because, according to them, there was no real dispute. This meant that there was no need for a motion to compel. The timeline issue is at the heart of the disagreement. The subpoena mentioned a time period starting from January 1, 2022, but Vanzan argued that the proper time period should start from the filing of the lawsuit in September 2024. However, Vanzan did not refuse to answer questions about topics before that date or refuse to provide a corporate representative to testify. They simply objected to the timeline, stating that they could meet and confer, and had no issue with answering questions on the relevant topics once the timeline was agreed upon. The defendants in this case believed that the whole subpoena was an attempt to create a fake dispute in order to draw attention to the case and to continue pushing a misleading narrative about Vanzan in the media. They were concerned about the fact that Vanzan, in their opinion, was trying to cover up the real reasons behind the lawsuit. The issue seemed to be that Blake Lively's company, Vanzan, had filed a lawsuit that had nothing to do with the movie It Ends With Us, or the claims about sexual harassment. Yet, they were demanding documents related to the movie, which didn't seem to match the claims in the original case. The defendants argued that the request for documents was improperly linked to a case that didn't even mention the film or the other allegations. They felt that the subpoena was seeking information that was unrelated to the actual case, which would be improper and a violation of court rules. Their concern was that they needed to understand why the documents were handed over by Stephanie Jones without any objection. How could a business owner just give up private information with no pushback, they questioned. Vanzan had some legal objections about the scope of the subpoena, including relevance, privilege, and the time period. However, the real concern seemed to be that the defendants were trying to create a narrative around the case. Vanzan argued that they had already agreed to provide the necessary documents, and that they would testify about the relationship with Stephanie Jones, but they objected to the time period mentioned in the subpoena. In the end, the judge dismissed the motion based on procedural grounds because the defendants hadn't properly met and conferred about the timeline. The judge said that if they couldn't agree, Kevin could file a new motion. After the motion was denied, there was still a possibility that the issues could be worked out, and the defendants could withdraw their objections. However, the Vanzan representatives were still not clear about who would actually show up for the deposition. Despite this, the fact that Vanzan had agreed to provide information about the relationship before September 2024 seemed to give Kevin what he wanted, even though the motion was technically denied. The situation remains unclear, with Vanzan continuing to refuse to provide some details, including who would attend the deposition, but it looks like the issues will continue to unfold. Interestingly, even though the legal battle seems to be ongoing, Blake Lively was seen at Disney World, and Ryan Reynolds was at another event, further complicating the situation and raising questions about their involvement with Vanzan. Blake Lively and her team seem to be avoiding the real issues surrounding their lawsuit and the subpoena they filed. Many legal experts I've spoken with have said that the Vanzan lawsuit wasn't filed properly. If they really had a dispute with Wayfair or the movie, they should have filed a lawsuit directly against the movie, Justin, and others involved. Instead, they used a shell company, Vanzan, to avoid attention and to prevent anyone from being notified about the subpoena. They targeted just one person, used the information they got, and filed a lawsuit based on that. It feels like a misuse of the legal process and an attempt to hide the truth. Blake and her team seem to be downplaying the situation, trying to minimize the shady nature of their actions. Adding to the confusion, Vanzan initially filed the lawsuit with one attorney but suddenly switched to a new attorney. If everything was legitimate, why all the secrecy and changes? It raises more questions about their motives and actions. Blake herself has been difficult to deal with, often making unreasonable demands that put Wayfair in a tough position. Wayfair is constantly forced to respond to false claims and bend to Blake's demands. For example, she has now asked the judge to make Wayfair turn over some information from a messaging app called Signal, claiming that they didn't give her everything she wanted. However, Wayfair's response has been that if those communications don't exist, they can't provide them. Blake has also falsely accused a company, Sourced Intelligence, of being involved in a digital campaign that they had nothing to do with. The judge made it clear that Blake had no evidence to support her claims, and even the CEO of Sourced Intelligence confirmed that they were not involved. The judge denied Blake's motion to compel them to provide information because there was no proof. Blake's history with subpoenas has been problematic, with her making overly broad requests and trying to gather information she's not entitled to. This is not the first time she has used the legal system to push for things that don't seem related to the case. That's why it's easy to believe that the Vanzan lawsuit was part of a similar strategy. I believe Wayfair is facing a tough fight, and Vanzan is making things even harder. This week, there was a story about someone being arrested near Taylor Swift's house. The tabloids claimed it was a process server trying to deliver legal documents to Taylor, but local sources denied that claim. The national media made it seem like the person was there to serve Taylor, but the locals weren't clear on why he was arrested. This situation seemed like an attempt to frame someone, possibly to distract from the issues with Vanzan. It looked like a way to paint a negative picture of someone involved in the legal proceedings. The Vanzan lawsuit is problematic because it doesn't mention anything about sexual harassment or retaliation, yet they are subpoenaing documents related to those issues. The subpoena to Stephanie Jones also seems suspicious. Wayfair and others want to understand the chain of custody of the evidence because if it was obtained improperly, it could make the case invalid. If it turns out that the evidence was gathered under false pretenses, it could lead to all of it being thrown out, which would completely undermine Blake's case. This entire situation seems like a series of games and tricks to delay the truth from coming out. Wayfair is trying to get the answers they need, but Blake and her team are making it difficult. It's clear that they are scrambling because the evidence they have could expose the whole scheme. If Wayfair gets the answers they need, it could destroy Blake's case, which is why they are trying so hard to make things difficult for Wayfair. In my opinion, it's all about trying to cover up the truth, and it's only a matter of time before it all unravels. What do you think about this situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on this case.